Tales from the Rails. Discovering the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The railway that got the world on track.
Hello and welcome to our 11th Tales from the Rails, our monthly podcast on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the railway that got the world on track. My name is Caroline Hardie. I'm an archaeologist, an author, the editor and a trustee for the charity the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. This week, Archie has offered to make the tea and continue his vital work of being editor, but my co-host is instead Angela Pickering, also from the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway.
Hello, Caroline. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to doing my very first podcast.
Well, welcome, Angela. So this week on Tales from the Rails, we are talking about the women of the S&DR. Now, I have a suspicion that a lot of people won't listen to this podcast because they might think it's not relevant to them if they're not a woman. They might think it's more of this woke nonsense. But the fact that large tranches of society have been written out of history should matter to us all. It's not just women who are not adequately represented and valued for their roles in the past, but also the working classes of both genders and ethnic minorities. So attempting to redress the balance just a little bit so that the history of the S&DR is not just about middle-aged white men of means actually matters, because without women, you're only getting half the story. History belongs to all of us. Our star of the S&DR this month is, in fact, Angela. Stay tuned in to find out why we've picked someone who is still alive.
We'll also be letting you know about the latest news. So get yourself a Christmas sherry, settle down in front of the scented candle, and enjoy this journey back to a time when women were treated as second-class citizens and weren't even invited to the banquets.
Tales from the Rails. This podcast is brought to you by the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, a registered charity set up to safeguard and promote the heritage of the railway that got the world on track. You can join us by visiting our website at www.sdr1825.org.uk.
In this show, we are going to try to uncover information about the women who lived or worked alongside the S&DR. This is remarkably challenging. Women have regularly been written out of history. Any roles they had as childbearer, the most dangerous job surely, and housekeeper, have rarely been considered worthy of documenting or rewarding with words that survive the test of time. Looking for the roles of women in railway history is even more challenging. Clearly, they were not driving the locomotives in the early days, but they were presumably feeding and caring for their families, possibly also doing other paid work and supporting their husbands to work and bring in the money. What conversations were had at home between husband and wife, mother and son, about the embryonic railways, about the safety of working on the line, the wisdom of investment amongst the wealthy, and the future of rail travel? Will it ever get a glimpse into these private worlds where women had an influence?
Amongst Quaker families, and the S&DR was largely funded by Quakers, where women were educated, the conversations amongst educated equals seems more likely here than in many households throughout the land. Having said that, setting up and running a business was such a male role it would never have occurred to the S&DR committee to have women at the committee meetings. It simply wouldn't have been an option, not a flicker of a notion that women might go along to the opening day banquets, not to eat anyway. They could watch from galleries while the men ate. So when they talk about there being 102 guests invited to the opening day banquet, I'll bet my last square of chocolate that was 102 men.
So women were not part of running the business, but they were stakeholders in the railway company before the railway proved its worth. So they risked their own personal finance on an untried experiment.
So let's start by looking at some of these shareholders, and I'm indebted to Maggie Poole of the Friends of the S&DR for digging out census and will information to help flesh out what we know about these women.
Annie and Harriet Peacock were sisters, and they both had shares. They were both unmarried and remained so, and were from Danby Hill in York. Annie had 2 shares to begin with, valued at £200, and she added to these, so she owned 10 shares worth £1,000 by 1822. Harriet Peacock started with 1 share.
Harriet and Annie were sisters to the Reverend Daniel Mitford Peacock. We know this because he's mentioned in Harriet's will. Harriet left a considerable sum in her will, and as she never had children, her assets went to siblings when she died, aged only 58 in 1840. The Reverend Daniel Mitford Peacock had a position within the S&DR committee. He was also a shareholder, and he was the chap who came up with the company motto, Periculum Privatum Utilitas Publica, at private risk for public service. So Harriet and Annie would have heard all about the S&DR from their brother.
Now here's an example of history quietly dropping references to women. Annie Peacock is mentioned in the text of Maurice Kirby's book on the origins of railway enterprise, published in 1996. It's a good book, and he has got her in there as a leading shareholder, but oddly, she doesn't feature in the index. An oversight, perhaps?
It might be an oversight, but it's a blooming nuisance when I'm trying to find her in the book again, so I've had to stick a post-it in the page. Several other women are listed in the ledgers. There are Quaker names, such as the Martins from Norwich, Emma Martin, spinster, Hannah Ransom Martin, also a spinster, so unmarried women are faring well. Margaret Atkinson from Stockton was a widow and a Quaker. She bought 1 share worth £100. She was of independent means and was described as a minister. She appears to have died in 1860, aged 81.
It will be no surprise that the adult daughters of the leading Quaker families involved in financing the S&DR would also buy shares, but they did so after the opening day. So Rachel Pease the younger, daughter of Edward and Rachel, had 10 shares worth £1,000. Her 22-year-old younger sister Elizabeth Pease had 5 shares. The Backhouse family, who were the bankers for the S&DR, also featured. Anne Backhouse, Darlington, spinster, had 2 shares. Eliza Backhouse, Darlington, spinster, had 5 shares.
So a quick glance through the share book suggests that the women buying shares were unmarried or widowed, and many, but not all, were from Quaker families. They were from wealthy families or of independent means. However, they were in a very small minority and were not typical of women in 1825. The total number of shares taken out before the opening day was 585, but our unmarried and widowed women only account for about 2% of them.
So what was the legal position for women in 1825?
Well, legally, women at this time were on thin ice. Wives were controlled by their husbands and had no real economic power. If they owned property prior to marriage, such as shares, they had to give it to their husbands on marriage until 1870, when the law changed. That's why there are no women shareholders who are married.
If rich women divorced, they lost custody of their children, regardless of circumstances. That was the law until 1839, when the law changed as a result of campaigning by Caroline Norton. Poor women had no real recourse to divorce. The poorest members of society were single women. It is not hard to imagine why.
On that note, I was actually going through some stuff, some company minutes and also some newspaper reports, and there were a few entries that actually do relate to what happens to women who end up being widowed because there is no support from them there. So very early on in October 1825, there's a newspaper report about young George Graham, who was killed on the new railway on Tuesday the 4th of October 1825 by a wagon running over his body. His death was reported, only took up 2.5 lines of the newspaper in the Durham Chronicle on the 8th of October. Now, when his father, George Graham, aged 38, was also killed by a road wagon running him over near Catterick only a few weeks later, it was reported in the Durham Chronicle on December the 14th. George had been working for Pickersgills, who were carriers, and the company that the S&DR and George Stephenson regularly used, and who also provided a passenger service. The newspaper referred to the coincidence of father and son being killed within a short period of time as a singular circumstance. One wonders if that's how Mrs. Graham, who would have described it, when caring for her remaining 9 children. I don't know how on earth she survived after that. But I also noticed that the Stockton and Darlington Railway gave out allowances. So here's an example of one that states to 1836, November the 18th in the company minutes. Ordered that Mary Cleasby, widow of James Cleasby, engineman, killed about 2 years ago on the railway, be allowed 20 shillings out of the fine box. Now that one little sentence raises so many things. First of all, her husband had been killed 2 years ago, and she's still having to ask for some help from the railway company after all that time. And the fine box, the company clearly don't have a budget to pay for compensation to these women, but they have a fine box where if enginemen have perhaps been travelling too quickly or haven't been operating appropriately or been found to be drunk, they're fined and the money goes into the box. And that's what they use occasionally to support women who've been widowed. Incidentally, it's also what they use to pay farmers when their pig gets run over by a train or a horse, and that appears in the minutes as well. So widows, pigs and horses are paid out of the fine box. Women's work opportunities were few, and when they did work, their wages were lower than male workers' wages.
Think all of this sounds unfair. Well, they can't express their outrage at the ballot box because women were not allowed to vote. In fact, in 1835, the Reform Act explicitly excluded them.
Although women had longer lifespans, childbirth was the most risky job. Out of 1,000 births, there were on average a little over 315 child deaths, and about 5 to 8% of women died as a result of childbirth. These weren't weak or sick women. Childbirth could kill off the most robust and healthy.
On that note, let's visit Ginny Stevenson. Locomotion No. 1's first regular engine driver was George Stephenson's elder brother James. His name was Jem. He was married to Jane Cummins, nicknamed Ginny, and they lived in Brusselton after the Hackworths moved out. They had 2 daughters, but in 1829 Ginny gave birth to a third and apparently died as a result. Engine drivers were quite well paid, so it is possible that Jem employed someone to look after the children. How else could he carry on with his job?
She's buried in St John's Churchyard in Shildon, but guess what? In the 1950s, the church decided to tidy up the graveyard. This would result in gravestones being moved or removed or buried over. Someone cleverly decided to record the gravestones first, but we can't locate Ginny's grave because whoever produced a plan of burials in the churchyard in 1954 made the decision only to record women and children's names if there were no men listed on the gravestone. So women were still being written out of history in the 20th century, even though it had been written in stone.
But at least Ginny's name is recorded, even if we know very little about her, but her story is incomplete. Many women with a connection to the railway don't even have names.
If a woman was killed on the railway, her name might not be recorded at all. An early casualty of the railway was an American blind beggar woman at Yarm, buried on March the 5th, 1827 by the rector of Eaglescliffe, John Brewster, who referred to her as a female, name unknown, whose age was past 40 and who had been killed by the steam machine on the railway. The inquest recorded a verdict of accidental death, but fined the engine 10 shillings as a deodand. A deodand was an ancient punishment whereby an item which had caused a human death was fined, or rather its owner was, in an attempt to make amends. We know the name of the man who buried her. We don't know her name. He didn't know her name. We don't know what a blind American woman was doing in Eaglescliffe either. What brought an American woman to Eaglescliffe? How did she become blind? This rather sums up women of the railways, but what a potentially interesting story.
But even when women were superheroes, their names were often not recorded. 2 unnamed women in 1835 surely avoided serious injury or death to coach passengers on the Brusselton incline. They were mentioned in John Graham's notebook, entry for 27th of November 1835.
On Tuesday night, 24th inst, some evil-disposed person or persons wantonly or maliciously laid some large stones upon the rail in Brusselton West Bank for the purpose, I have no doubt, of throwing the coach off the way, but fortunately were seen and removed by 2 young women.
Another almost nameless woman was Mrs. Anderson of Spout Lane between Thickley and New Shildon. Her husband, Joseph Anderson, was appointed as an accountant at the Way House there in May 1827, but his job took him to various parts of the railway. When he was away, Mrs. Anderson covered for him. But because she wasn't employed directly, we don't have her first name or any other details. Yet she must have been responsible for keeping the railway running here for at least half the working week.
New Shildon was populated by migrant families. Many of the jobs associated with the S&DR were based here, but New Shildon didn't exist before the railway opened in 1825. That meant there were no houses or lodgings to move into and no facilities such as schools or taverns. There were no houses ready. The men lived in lodgings until houses were built for them and their families, so women stayed behind until there was somewhere to live.
Of the engine drivers, engineers, navvies to build the line, few were local. George Stephenson called on the skilled men he had worked with previously at Killingworth to join him on the S&DR. The women often followed husbands from coal mining areas in Northumberland and Wales to the railway. That meant leaving extended families behind. Brothers would join together. George's own brother James joined him. But older, less economically productive parents could be left behind. But it was older family members who assisted with childcare. That support network was lost. The impact this upheaval had on poorer women is largely unrecorded, but Jane Hackworth, from the wealthier artisan class, was one such migrant woman.
Jane Hackworth nee Golightly was Timothy Hackworth's wife. He was the company's first resident mechanical engineer, a hugely talented man who's going to be largely responsible for keeping the locomotives and stationary engines running. Jane was described as a woman of great individuality, competent, energetic, and an admirable housewife. Tall, handsome, well-educated. She entered into her husband's work, social, religious and professional, with great heartiness and sympathy. She was a stalwart support to Timothy. Without Timothy, the S&DR would have been a technological backwater that nobody would have heard of. Jane's role as housewife, carer and cook, educator of the children, allowed Timothy to concentrate on his engineering. In her younger days, she converted to Methodism and met Timothy attending Methodist meetings round about 1810 to 11. He too was a convert from the Church of England. They married in 1813 at Ovingham Parish Church in Northumberland. Their religion was clearly important to them. Timothy left his job in Wylam in 1815 when he was asked to work on the Sabbath. One presumes Jane was in agreement with this, but I expect there was much hand-wringing over the decision, and at the time they had one child.
She gave birth to 6 daughters and 3 sons, one of whom, Thomas, a twin, died shortly after birth in 1825, and only a few months before her husband took up work for the S&DR. Timothy was living in lodgings in Darlington at the time. She remained in Walbottle. He was concerned about her well-being after the birth of twins and the subsequent loss of one, and wrote advising her to go for walks and drink a gill of ale before going out.
The family got together again and first moved into Brusselton while the new family home was being built in New Shildon. It was ready in 1826.
There are letters between Timothy and Jane in the archives at the NRM in York, and some are online. Throughout their marriage, he expresses great love and affection for her, misses her deeply, misses the children. There is a lot of love in these letters. Timothy Hackworth's concern for her health and the fact that it's too hot to go horse riding, in his opinion, could come across a bit patronising, but in July 1825 he writes to Jane.
If you can, send a letter to Mr. Stevenson on Tuesday or Wednesday. We expect him here on Thursday. Otherwise, the port office tell Brother Thomas to get as much help as possible. Walker of Newburn and Hardie Wilson with boiler and all he has to do. God bless you in the sincere prayer of your sincerely, affectionately husband, Timothy Hackworth.
So here he is instructing her, or asking for her help, on engineering work matters, and as a go-between with George Stephenson and Timothy's brother, Thomas, who was also a well-respected engineer.
Both Jane and Timothy believed that education should be accessible to all their children, not just the boys. We've discussed this in our education podcast, but it was important. That belief in education extended to the wider community and the creation of Shildon's Railway Institute in 1833. Jane laid the foundation stone for the new chapel at New Shildon, now demolished, and then gave the address. That's the sort of thing men usually did. When the chapel was ready, She rode 40 miles to seek an able minister to open it.
She died 2 years after Timothy in 1852 in the house at New Shildon, where she had been living since 1831 and was living with her widowed or married daughters, one of her sons, and a grandson, plus a servant.
So in many ways, her relationship with her husband and her role in the family was of its time: the housekeeper, the mother, the feeder, the educator of her children. But she was much more: highly educated, staunchly religious, brave enough to convert to Methodism, respected sufficiently or strong enough of character to open the new chapel in 1831, a consultee to her husband's engineering work, and that her horsewomanship suggests a real strength of character. Her husband was away a lot, so she will have run the house without him, often, and had a high profile and respected role in the community. She encapsulates the partnership that is the relationship between two adults who are bringing up children, feeding them, educating them, and earning a living to make sure there's enough money to do so.
Despite the female children being educated, however, Jane's children didn't necessarily thrive. Two of her daughters, Anne and Mary, had mental health issues and ended up in asylums.
One daughter, Elizabeth, who became Elizabeth Holmes through marriage to Samuel Holmes, refused to allow her own 3 daughters to do anything. Only her son, Samuel Jr., had freedom to thrive. Elizabeth's 3 daughters were intelligent. One was a natural musician, but their narrow, imposed lives had an impact on their mental health, and one became an alcoholic.
And despite Timothy's important role with the S&DR, the family was not wealthy on his death, and few businesses were interested in buying his business or his house. So her last 2 years were fraught with financial worries.
So let's take a look now at the Stockton and Darlington Railway's passenger service and the women associated with it. In the early years of the developing railway, the company decided to concentrate on goods traffic and permitted local businesses to run passenger travel for a fee and to an agreed contract with rules and regulations.
Women had a significant role to play in providing this passenger service on the S&DR, but largely because they were widows, taking over the family business after their husband's death.
One such female innkeeper mentioned in those early days of rail travel was Martha Howson of Stockton. The then Martha Ludley was born in Grantham, Lincolnshire in early 1778. She married George Howson, and around the beginning of 1810 they took over Stockton's prestigious coaching inn, the Black Lion, on the High Street. George passed away in 1820, but because of, in Martha's words, his prior lamented incapacity, she'd already sustained the whole weight of the business by herself. The business involved not simply operating the inn, but the running of 2 road coaches and the hiring out of post-chaises with able horses and careful drivers.
Martha's Inn, the Black Lion, was the go-to place for railway celebrations. After the first rail was ceremoniously laid at St John's Well in 1822, the gentlemen of the ceremonial party proceeded thereafter to an excellent dinner at the town's house, and the workmen were plentifully regaled with bread, cheese and ale at the Black Lion Inn.
By the time the railway opened, she had renamed her inn the Black Lion Hotel. The railway company had initiated passenger travel along the track in 1825 by running its experiment coach from Durham Lane in Darlington to the quayside in Stockton. By May 1826, other operators were allowed to put coaches on the line in return for a toll of 3d a mile, and they had to comply with regulations set out in June 1826.
Martha's Black Lion property ran from the High Street down a burgage plot to the riverside, where the Stockton and Darlington Railway had their warehouses, offices, wharves, and from 1826 a tavern, much on land that Martha had previously owned. That was also where Pickersgills had garaged their passenger coach, but now other operators were invited to run the service too.
Martha teamed up with Richard Scott of Darlington's premier coaching inn, the King's Head. Incidentally, Richard Scott had 1 share in the railway company. They provided a service running the Defence and Defiance coaches between Richard's King's Head and Martha's Black Lion in Stockton.
Martha will have taken a share of the receipts for booking passengers, receiving parcels, caring for horses, etc. Then, on 16th of October 1826, her inn was the starting point at which passengers and parcels are booked for the heavily promoted elegant new railway coach, the Union on its journey on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, also calling it Yarm.
On the 9th of November 1827, the company decided to regulate stopping points for passengers, and one of those was Martha's Black Lion Yard on the quayside at Stockton.
In 1833, the S&DR bought out the private railway coach operators, but Martha had died in February 1832, aged 53, when she was still described as keeper of the Black Lion. After all her involvement in the early railway, it was her brother, William Ludley, who had succeeded her at the inn, who was awarded compensation of £20 by the railway company and had his name immortalised in its minutes.
But Richard Scott of the King's Head had also previously died, and his widow, Jane Scott, had been running the passenger service between Darlington and Stockton via Yarm. So that was two women running a significant part of the passenger service on the S&DR. And so it was with Jane Scott that the S&DR negotiated and agreed terms on the 27th of September 1833, which would allow them to take back the passenger service from her.
She was bought out from owning her 2 passenger coaches, £50, for car and harness, £10, for alterations and repairs as per bills, and 1 coach, £51, 78 shillings 8 pence, compensation £40, totalling £151, 7 shillings and 8 pence.
The fact that 2 women were running the passenger service for some time prior to 1833 is largely overlooked, possibly because the passenger service is often treated as a poor relation by railway historians. They do this because the railway company didn't force it to move towards locomotive power until 1833, choosing instead to focus on the more profitable freight traffic. There's also a tendency for historians to write that the passenger service was an afterthought. This is simply not true. It was devised later than the original concept of a railway, but it was still devised, planned and authorised 2 years before the opening. In fact, at the same time as locomotives were introduced. So the S&DR was designed to carry passengers long before it opened.
Over in Shildon, another woman's widowhood brought about changes, but the extent to which she ended up running the passenger service is less clear.
Daniel Adamson ran one of the earliest passenger coach services from Shildon on the S&DR in 1827 using his Perseverance coach. His pub was the Grey Horse Inn on Byerley Road. It was there before the railway. It appears that his horse-drawn coach would travel from the pub down to the Mason's Arms, where it would join the main line. His job as landlord at the Grey Horse Inn was taken over by his son William in 1828, according to White's Trade Directory.
In 1830, Shildon Lodge Colliery was sunk directly behind the Grey Horse Inn by the Surtees family, and the following year, a little branch line, the Surtees Railway, connected the pit to the S&DR. This branch ran through what is now the Hackworth Recreational Park. In fact, a path follows the line and ran in front of Hackworth's house. The pub, therefore, found itself line-side, so Daniel could, should he want to, run his passenger coach directly from his inn, on track, rather than by road to the Mason's Arms, which he had been doing since 1826-27.
But old Dan Adamson died in February 1832 when the passenger service was still being run by him. At a time with no state pension or support for widows, Anne Adamson had to take over some of Dan's work. But just how much did she take on?
A newspaper advert dated August 1832 referred to an auction to be held at the house of Mrs. Adamson, the sign of the Grey Horse in Old Shildon. This suggests that she had taken over the licence of the pub. She was still listed as the landlady of the Grey Horse in 1834.
It's not clear if she also took over the passenger service in 1832, but Anne Adamson is referred to in a notebook by the Stockton and Darlington Railway's engineer John Graham in 1833. She was responsible for leading coal-laden wagons down the Surtees line to the main line at New Shildon on behalf of the Surtees family, and this was done by horse.
In 1833, the S&DR company reminded Anne Adamson that horse-drawn traffic was no longer acceptable, and locomotives were to be used instead. Anne resisted this move and was supported by Mr. Surtees, much to the annoyance of the railway company. The rule not to use horses would have required the Surtees or Anne to pay for access to a locomotive, and neither wanted to run to the expense.
So the documentary evidence suggests that she was a pub landlady for the pub that ran the passenger service, but was also responsible for coal traffic being moved down the Surtees branch line to the S&DR. It is not clear if she took over running the passenger service with their passenger coach, the Perseverance, but when the S&DR bought out private coach operators, the Adamsons were not listed, so it doesn't look like the Adamsons were running the passenger service.
Anne went on to be listed as the landlady of this tavern, and possibly another until she died, aged 80 years, in February 1860. So another woman associated with the railway, but what her exact role was requires further research.
When the railways finally employed women, it was to do womanly jobs of cleaning and caring, such as Mary Simpson, employed to keep the waiting room and shop in good order for travellers at the passenger station on Northgate in Darlington, 1833. Mary is the first female to be employed by the S&DR, and we know nothing about her. She didn't stay long and was replaced by a man. The committee minute recording her appointment initially didn't name her. Instead, it says that the shop should be occupied by a female. That's female with a capital F. And later someone has written in tiny penciled letters, Mrs. Simpson. That was a close one. She was nearly another unnamed woman. Luckily, a later minute setting out her responsibilities did record her name properly.
We've discussed Rachel Pease, wife of Edward Pease of Darlington, in previous podcasts, so there's no point in repeating that here. But suffice to say, we have in Rachel a strong, educated woman who not only gave birth to and brought up 8 children, but also had the position of minister, travelling amongst Quaker communities. As a Quaker, she would have been anti-slavery, anti-war, pro-animal welfare and pro-education. In that respect, her daughters would have been well educated too.
We don't really have time today to look at Hannah Backhouse in much detail. You can read about her in our most recent edition of The Globe, which you'll be able to buy from our website from January 2025. And if you're already a member of the Friends, you'll have seen it. But I'll try to summarise this remarkable woman. She was part of the Quaker Backhouse family who were financiers of the S&DR, occupiers of Poleham Hall, and who travelled around the country and Ireland with her husband Jonathan before embarking on travels around the slave-owning states of America, visiting other Quaker communities and speaking out against slavery. I noticed that an account of one of those Friends meetings in Pennsylvania, her visit was recorded as, "Our esteemed friend Hannah Chapman Backhouse and her husband Jonathan Backhouse, being on a religious visit to friends in these parts, attended this meeting from Darlington, dated the 16th of the 3rd month, 1830. This subtle ordering of Hannah as the main visitor with Jonathan as her husband suggests that she's leading this journey.
Hannah stayed on in the US when in January 1832, Jonathan returned to tie up his interests in Darlington, and in December 1832, he retired as treasurer of the S&DR and returned to the US, surviving a terrible storm, and he rejoined Hannah. For the next 2 years, they toured Ohio and Indiana, crossing the River Ohio by stepping from ice floe to ice floe and pushing deep into the slave-owning states of Tennessee and Kentucky. Hannah drove her own carriage, crossed a river in a hollowed-out canoe, and slept on straw on the floor of a railroad coach. Her main concerns were the education of the people she came into contact with and her opposition to slavery.
In October 1834, she wrote from North Carolina, "We have now been travelling some hundreds of miles through slave states. The distress of seeing these poor creatures on the road just bought up by the slave dealers, separated from the nearest relations of life, never more in all probability to be heard of again by them, is unspeakably great. Could you see what I see and hear what I hear, you would not wonder that we are called to suffer as we do. No one who has not seen it can tell me what slavery is." Hannah continued her ministering around the UK for a couple of years after her husband's death in 1842, until her health began to deteriorate, and she died on May the 6th, 1850, aged 63.
So the women of the S&DR invested in the business, if wealthy, and had some connection to it. They were rarely employed directly by the S&DR, but were subcontracted, as in the passenger service, or supported their husbands in their work for the railway. Women were more regularly employed by the rail industry from the start of the 20th century, largely due to covering for absent men fighting in the First and Second World Wars. These women were not treated the same as men. Training was usually withheld, which meant they couldn't be engine drivers. Travelling privileges were withheld. They were required to resign on being married, and they were sacked when the men returned home from fighting. Their jobs were varied, but mostly clerical work, ticket collecting, porters and cleaning work.
There was another curious role for a few women from 1925, 100 years after the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. We chatted to Dave Reynolds and Jane Hackworth-Young about this a couple of months ago.
When was the first railway queen?
Well, there was only one railway queen officially crowned from Shildon. The railway queen scheme was introduced by the big four railway companies as part of the centenary celebrations that were held in 1925. That's when the first railway queen was crowned. And it wasn't really a Shildon thing. It was a national thing. The different principal railway towns, should we say, around the country, they would nominate somebody from each of their towns. And it was usually a daughter of somebody, one of the railway families. And they would take part in a contest, but it wasn't a glamour contest, rather like you expect, with Miss World, Miss United Kingdom. It was far more than that. And the idea of the railway queen was to become an ambassador for the railways. They would have one international visit each year, and the railway queen would wear a ceremonial chain. And each country they visited, they would visit the railway companies there. They would go around, and they would be presented with a link to add to the chain. So every year the chain got one link longer. And it was partly an ambassadorial role, so partly letting the other countries know about the progress of the railways in the United Kingdom. It was partly a charitable role as well, so it was to promote the convalescent homes that the railway companies ran and to help raise funding for those homes. So quite an interesting scheme, and it ran right through until 1975. There was a decision made that 50 years of railway queens was quite enough. So the railway queen of 1975 was the very last. But there was only one to come from Shildon, and that was Irene Topham in 1938.
It's absolutely fascinating. I didn't know about the chain of office and it having a link added. It's almost like a metaphor for railways, isn't it? How they grow and connect communities. I think that's so interesting. Well, that brought us up to the 20th century. In 2025, it will be 200 years since the start of the modern railway network. But believe it or not, it will only be 71 years since the first female was appointed as a train driver in this country. That was Karen Harrison, who applied to join British Rail in 1977 as Kay Harrison. So she only got the interview because they thought she was a man, and became qualified in 1979 despite huge opposition.
She was made of tough stuff, but still had a terrible time from many of her male colleagues and managers. Some men refused to work with her, and her locker was defaced. She was only 19 years old when she became a train driver. She also became a leading light in the Train Drivers' Union, ASLEF. She left due to ill health. She caught meningitis and went on to study law, but died before completing her studies, aged only 50 in 2011.
Things are a little better now for women who wish to become train drivers, thanks in part to Karen's campaigning, but it's still a male-dominated profession. In January 2023, a mural was unveiled at Euston Station celebrating Karen Harrison. It was commissioned by Avanti West Coast as part of the operators' campaign for a fifth of new recruits to be women. So how many female train drivers are there now in the UK? Well, today, women account for approximately 1 in 5 of the railway workforce as a whole, but only 8.5% of train drivers are women. But things are changing. Amongst the younger train drivers, aged 40 or below, the percentage that are women is higher at 14%. As British Rail used to say, we're getting there.
Stars of the S&DR.
Well, you've already been listening to this month's Star of the S&DR, and that's Angela Pickering. Angela is a volunteer at a heritage railway and has been trained in various operational roles. She qualified as a train driver in 2017, or to avoid the wrath of pedants, should I be calling you a locomotive driver, a train driver, an engine driver? Angela?
Well, if it's a locomotive or an engine, that's fine. But if it's a train, it's got to have more than just the locomotive. It's got to have some carriages or wagons behind it.
Indeed. So, for people who don't know Tanfield Railway, where you volunteer, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it's a heritage steam railway. It's approximately 3 miles long near Gateshead, Stanley. Its main focus is on northeast built locomotives and northeast builders. We use the era of 1920 to 1950 in everything we do.
Actually, if anybody's visiting this area, especially in 2025, it's well worth going to see Tanfield Railway. It's actually really beautiful, isn't it? It's got lovely woodland walks for the dogs and for people. You can walk through the woodland one way and get a steam train back the other way. And the Causey Arch is stunning, isn't it? Set in a valley. So what sort of engines do you drive?
They're industrial engines, tank engines, so a bit smaller than the mainline ones. And we've also got a few diesels that sometimes come out.
And you drive those as well, do you?
Yeah.
So how did you end up being a locomotive driver at Tanfield? What track took you there?
I think I'll have to blame Thomas the Tank Engine for that one. My son was very keen on Thomas the Tank Engine when he was from 2 years on. And then it just stayed with us. Railways was the go-to holiday and, days, trips out. So we went to a lot of railways, but Tanfield was always a special one for us. And when he got to 11 years old, he wanted to join the youth team, but had to be 12. So he needed a parent on site, and that's how I started. So it was not my intention to become a driver or a signalman or anything, but it just fell into place. I started off working in the tea room. While I was on site, I thought, well, I should do something, and nobody minded me washing up pots. So I started with that. And then I was asked if I wanted to do crossing keeper. So I was trained for that, then guard, and then signalman, and then on the footplate.
Right. So that process, how long did it take from, say, starting looking after the crossing as crossing keeper to qualifying as a driver? How long did that take?
It's difficult to say, really, because some of it overlapped. But probably I was there about a year before I started on the crossing. So 2007, I think we started there. So about a year on to qualify on the crossing, or a bit before that. And then it kind of just processed, because if you just want to be a locomotive driver, you have to start at the bottom. I know all railways are different, but at Tanfield, you start doing cleaning work, working in the shed, getting to know the locomotives and how they work and fixing them, helping with that side of things, the maintenance. And then you go on the footplate as a cleaner. So you're on with 2 trained staff, the driver and a fireman. And then you progress, you pass a bit so you can go on with a driver, just firing. And then it moves on from there. So it does take, it depends how often you're there and how quickly you learn. Yeah. So it can probably take 5 years at least, I would think.
It sounds like a really good process, actually, because by doing it that way, you're really going to get to know not just the engines that you could be driving, but all the parts of them and how they run and what makes them run well before you even get to the point of training to be a driver.
Yeah, the actual driving's not the difficult bit, but it is difficult in some situations, but it's knowing what to do when something goes wrong.
Sure.
You are actually sitting on something that could blow up, so you need to be aware of how to get the fire out quickly if you need to.
That sounds a bit nerve-wracking. So of all the steps that you took to get to that point and all the jobs that you did, which is the one that's your favourite?
Oh, it's difficult, really. They all have good things about them. Being a guard, I know this is going to sound corny, but meeting the passengers and talking to them, that is really a big thing, and what's nice about being a guard. Signalling it's quieter, but you can get other things done when you're in the signal box. And of course, you've got the fire going, so everybody comes in to warm up. And I have made toasted tea cakes for people on it before now.
Oh, that sounds lovely.
Being on the footplate, It's just nice working with locomotives, bringing them into steam. I suppose firing's better on the footplate.
Mm-hmm.
There's more of a challenge. You've got to have the pressure ready, but at the same time, you don't want too much, so you're wasting money by it blowing off.
So tell us a bit more about those challenges, because obviously what you're feeding the engine is going to change depending on the incline and whether you're on the level.
Yes. Well, part of your training is knowing the route when the driver's going to need pressure going up the hill, or not so much going down a hill, and you try not to blow off because you're wasting money. And I suppose the satisfaction of you going up the bank towards Andrew's house, and you've got to have a good fire and good pressure, but when you get up there, you've got to have enough space in the boiler to put extra water in to cool it down so it's not blowing off.
So these are exactly the things that people were learning on the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825. Yeah. Presumably people like Jem Stevenson came down with those skills already, but other people were going to go through exactly this process and getting to know the route really well. And you know,
yeah.
So that's really interesting. It sounds to me also like actually stoking the engine would burn quite a lot of calories and get rid of bingo wings. Just asking for a friend.
Yeah. Well, it's not too strenuous, really. Neither are pulling signal levers. I'd say really the guard's job, the amount of walking that a guard does is quite incredible, and climbing up and down from carriages, when you're cleaning them when there's no platform. So being a guard is quite a workout, because I have to clean them, check the carriages are all right in the morning. So there's quite a lot of checking to do, and you are climbing in and out without any platform.
So do you have many women colleagues at Tanfield, say, who are on the footplate?
Yeah, there's 2 young women training now. One's actually a fireman in another railway, but she does work at Tanfield as well. So they're coming on. There's a crossing keeper. I think at the moment I'm the only female guard, but we have had females in the past. And we have had, there was a female fireman on when I started.
Do you have to get your own uniform when you're being a guard, or do they have them there already? It's because we're in a certain era, we have black trousers, black waistcoat, black jackets, but we get our own, and we have to wear, obviously, safety shoes. We're issued with gloves. Right.
Yeah.
Is that the only thing you're issued with? Gloves?
Gloves, yeah.
Right.
Gloves. The thin paper type overalls if you're going into the smoke box or something to do a bit of a cleaning job.
So how well are women represented on other heritage railways as drivers, for example?
They are scattered around. There are some. Yeah, there are. It's not necessarily a job that a lot of women want to do. You've got to not mind having a black face and dirty fingernails.
Have you got dirty fingernails today, Angela?
Well, actually, I was firing up an engine yesterday. But yeah, they are a little bit. So my hand's hidden underneath the desk.
So you don't spend a lot of money on getting your hands manicured better?
No.
I've got to ask, what's your son doing now? Because this was quite a while ago when he was only 2 years old.
He's 28 now. He's the transport manager at Beamish Museum. He also drives, fires and does all the other jobs at Tanfield, and he does at North Tyneside Museum. He drives there as well. So
I'm so glad he ended up doing something like that. It would have been so sad if he'd gone into something else. So if there are other women listening, maybe they're thinking about a career on the railways in general, or they're looking for a post-career challenge, maybe they're retiring, but they're fit and looking for something else to do, and they'd like to be a locomotive driver, what would be your advice to them?
Well, if they want it as a career, I would say apply for jobs or any of the mainline railways, and you start off there and move you out. But I don't know the exact route for them all, but I would say you have to keep trying, because I believe every engineman's job that comes up there is pretty well, swamped with applications. If they are looking for a post-career or a hobby, if they go to a heritage railway, a steam railway, they might like to try it first by having an experience day.
Oh, that's a good idea.
They might be better trying that, because if they do find it too strenuous, not everybody can shovel coal, or they don't like getting so dirty. You've got to be prepared for extreme weather conditions. I mean, if you're on an open locomotive and it's snowing or sleet, rain, and you're going up the bank, you're going to get wet and cold and
That's
dirty.
really good advice, actually, because these driver experiences are great presents.
You've got to have a healthy respect for steam pressure as well.
Right.
and be prepared to work hard. You know, it's you can't just go straight on to the footplate. You have to learn your way.
I remember John Cree in July 1828 got blown up by locomotion number 1 because he didn't have a healthy respect for steam pressure.
Yes.
Take note, people. Angela, will you be on the footplate over Christmas and New Year?
No, I've done two firing ups for steam tests last week and this week, but I'm not rostered for the footplate. I've got a signalling turn, but I've got another volunteer job of looking after foster dogs that have been trained for deaf people. So I've got one of those all of next week, so I won't be there.
That sounds like another lovely job, actually.
It is.
Oh, Angela, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Tales from the Rails, steaming ahead to 2025.
Right, so this is where we look at the news. So over to you, Angela.
Members of the Friends will have received their PDF copies of The Globe, our twice-a-year magazine stuffed with articles and news. Thank you to everyone who contributed. Feedback received suggests it's a good one. In fact, somebody said it was the best ever. The new draft of the Darlington Circular is now complete and off to the designer.
Radio 4 have commissioned a documentary called How Railways Shrank Space and Time, which will come out in 2025. We're currently working with them, providing historic background information and quotes, while local musician Sam Slatcher is working with their sound engineer on the musical accompaniment.
We have had a £10,000 donation from Lord Wrigglesworth to spend at the Stockton end of the line. That means we now have funding in place to revise all our walk booklets, and we are discussing how best to spend the rest of the money at the east end of the line. So thank you, Lord Wrigglesworth.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to publicity about Hyington over the last month, we've had more donations, but we still need a sizable £400,000 boost to be able to buy it and start the rescue works. Meanwhile, though, we've submitted a pre-app consultation with vast amounts of help from Owen Plummer of Purcell Architects to the local planning authority, Durham County Council. We've done this to make sure our plans to rescue and find a sustainable use for the building will be supported by the planners, and we can then provide reassurance to potential funders that what we are doing is approved of by the planning authority.
The S&DR comms officer, Jill Reid, has left for pastures new. We wish her the best of luck and look forward to meeting her replacement, who starts in January. This is a really important post, as without it, nobody will know what is happening throughout 2025.
Earlier this year, I nominated the S&DR's civil engineer Thomas Story for a Blue Plaque Award. Thomas Story was our star of the S&DR in our very first podcast on the opening day. He oversaw the construction of the line, was appointed civil engineer in 1825 to partner Timothy Hackworth's role as mechanical engineer, and so oversaw the construction of nearly everything the S&DR built. Then he was the main engineer for the Newcastle to York line, which became the East Coast Main Line. Well, I'm very disappointed to say that Historic England rejected it. Historic England say they hope I will not be too disappointed, but competition was tough. Well, I am disappointed. Don't they know what's happening next year? Don't they realise that 2025 is the year the modern railway started and it was built by Thomas Story? Disappointed? I'm livid.
The next Walk in the Line event is on the 3rd of January at the west end of the line, starting at Broom Mill Farm at 10:20 a.m. It would help if people wishing to attend booked in. Just contact us through the website.
Hot off the press, literally only got this about an hour ago, our planning application and listed building consent to restore and conserve part of Edward Peasy's house in Darlington has just been granted. So we've now got planning permission and listed building consent. And that's great news because it hopefully means that at least one small part of Edward Peasy's house is going to look a lot better in the course of 2025 than it does now. And hopefully we can actually start looking at restoring Edward Peasy's parlour as subsequently depicted by Alfred Rankley in a painting. And you'll be able to find out lots more about this as we proceed. That's it for another month. Thank you for listening. If you feel like getting your teeth stuck into some research, why not explore the less represented people in our history?
There are other shareholders we didn't mention today. we need to find out more about them. There is much more to find out about Ginny Stevenson, Anne Adamson, Jane Scott, Mrs. Anderson, and just what was the backstory of the blind American beggar woman. Today, we largely looked at wealthy or artisan class women, or the wives of the skilled professionals, but we got nothing on the working class women, the women married to the navvies, for example.
And what about ethnic minorities? Were there any of people of colour working along the S&DR? What about people of different sexuality? My goodness, they'd work hard to hide that, but statistically it was out there, and there may be unsubstantiated evidence for it amongst the most famous of engineers.
History should tell all of our stories, not just the stories of white men. So if you want a project, there's plenty to do, and it can be fascinating stuff.
Next month's podcast is our last one. When we started, we set out to create 12 of them. Honestly, we haven't decided what the subject will be for the next one, so feel free to make suggestions. I had originally been thinking about doing deaths and destruction as our theme, but I thought that's a bit of a miserable way to end the podcast. Perhaps we could explore the forthcoming festival. Let us know what you think. So, thank you for listening. Thank you to Archie, who is, of course, an indispensable member of the team and will still be our editor, even if he has banished himself to the kitchen this time. Thanks always to Dave Reynolds for our theme music. Thank you to Angela for joining me today. I hope you'll come back again, Angela. If you're listening to this as soon as it comes out, have a great Christmas, Happy New Year. If you're listening to it much later, we hope you really enjoyed 2025, the 200th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Goodbye.
Goodbye.